Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. In this video I'm going to share how I ranked my medical rotations after I left medical school, a simple framework that I found really helpful, some other useful resources, and also some reflections on whether I would have done things differently. So there are a lot of different stages during medical school where you have to make a decision between many different options for medical training. So for example, in the UK, when I left medical school, I had about 120 different rotations, which I had to rank in order of preference. And these rotations were typically over the course of 2 years. It would be a series of 4-month placements. So for example, the rotations that I had in my first 2 years as a doctor were geriatric medicine, psychiatry, A&E, acute medicine, cardiology, and cardiothoracic surgery. And I imagine there are similar sorts of processes outside the UK as well. But the difficult thing about making decisions at these stages is you have such a huge number of different alternatives and you're expected to be able to rank them all in preference order. So for example, as I said, I think I had 110 different rotations and each of them were different combinations of 6 different specialities, all at different hospitals and in different locations. So it's incredibly difficult to accurately create a preference order within that. And also it's very time consuming. And it's also pretty important because this is 2 years of your life that you're spending at a particular hospital doing particular specialities. And yet we're supposed to make decisions when we actually really don't have too much information because we don't know really what it's like to work in that hospital or in that speciality without having done so before. But I'm going to share a few things I think we're thinking about and also some suggested approaches to take to make this decision. So the first thing is the kind of factors that you want to consider when you're deciding what sort of hospital you want to work at. And broadly for me, those are location. Is it somewhere you could see yourself living? Is it a nice town? Is there a lot of things going on in that town? Are any of your friends or relatives living in that area that you could hang out with? And is it somewhere you could see yourself spending 1 year, 2 year, 4 years, however much time you're going to spend in that one place? Another thing is the size of the hospital. So in general, in smaller hospitals, you often get more responsibility because there's fewer doctors around. And sometimes it's also a bit more friendly and you're a bit more involved within the team. Whereas at larger hospitals, there'll be a lot more specialized cases. So there's certain things that in a smaller hospital, they wouldn't actually be treated. They'll then get transferred to a larger hospital. So you're only going to see those if you're working at a larger hospital. Another factor is just the reputation of the hospital itself. So from talking to friends, colleagues, previous people who've worked at that hospital, you can build up a bit of an impression of what that hospital is like. Although you should take it with a bit of a pinch of salt because there's variations between different departments and someone might have had a negative experience in one department. It doesn't necessarily mean that another department is not going to be as enjoyable. And another thing to bear in mind if you are academically inclined is what's the academic output of that hospital? So are there a lot of papers being published? Are there different research groups doing work in different departments? Because if you want to get a bit of research done while you're there, it's pretty useful to be able to latch onto these kind of groups that are producing outputs. Now the approach that I took, because I got a bit overwhelmed with the number of different rotations that I had on offer and trying to rank them all in terms of order, is that I devised a system whereby I looked at every different speciality and I gave it a preference score from, I think it was from 2 down to -2. So something I really wanted to do, such as general practice, psychiatry, emergency medicine, I'd give it a 2. And then something I'm a little bit less interested in, but still keen to do, like cardiology, respiratory, I'd give it a 1. 0 if I didn't really mind too much, -1, -2, you get the idea. And then what that enabled me to do is I put all of the rotations into an Excel sheet and I wrote some very simple if statements, which essentially just tallied up this total, which then gave me a score for every one of the rotations. So I just dragged that down and that automatically gave me a preference order based on the rotations that were within each of these options. And if I can find that document, then I will include it on the screen here or maybe over here. If I can't find it, then I hope that that makes sense from what I've explained. And then once I had that preference order based on the scores that I'd given it, I then looked at it and jiggled it around a little bit more. I had preferences for certain locations, so I'd automatically put those locations up higher. If 2 different sets of rotations had the same score, then I would just rank the one with the better location higher by default. But I think the key difficulty throughout this whole process, and something that I don't think there's really an easy solution to, is the fact that for any rotation that you do, you don't really know how the team is actually going to be. And the most important thing for the experience that you have is the team that you work with. But that team is going to be made up of people who are also rotating onto your specialty and you just happen to be spending time with, which obviously you don't know in advance because when you're applying, the other people haven't also got the position yet. And then also just generally like the ward dynamic and how the team is and how things are run. And that's also pretty hard to know in advance because you would have to know someone who's worked on that ward in the past. And if there's a relatively small number of rotations that you're deciding between, it might be feasible to try and reach out to people in the past who have done those exact rotations of those exact specialities at those different hospitals. But it can be pretty tricky to do that, especially once you have multiple different rotations that you're considering. So you're kind of in a position, at least how I felt, that you can't really fully know exactly what those rotations are going to be like when you're making the decision. So it can't be a fully informed decision. And you're just kind of working with probabilities of what you think will be the most interesting based on the content, like the actual specialities that you're covering and the location that you are. Whereas what I would say is probably more important for a day-to-day experience is actually the team that you're working with and the way the ward is run. If you do want to go down the route where you reach out to people who've done these rotations in the past, good places to start would be Facebook groups. There's a lot of different Facebook groups of doctors who finished F1, F2. At least these are the UK specific ones. I imagine there's similar groups elsewhere. And I would probably just send out a standardized message to as many people as I can to try and find people who are willing to answer a few questions about the experiences that they had when they were on a particular rotation. And the kinds of questions that I would consider asking somebody who's done a previous rotation, if I'm trying to size up whether I will enjoy that rotation or how things will be, are how well supported are they? Are there a lot of senior doctors? How much time do the senior doctors spend on the ward? How much teaching do you get? Do you get a lot of teaching while you're on ward rounds, while you're working during the day? Do you get a lot of teaching time that's protected where you have an hour or 2 hours or an afternoon that is set aside for teaching? How sociable was the ward in general? How friendly were the nurses? How friendly were the senior doctors? Did you have time to socialize with the other people on your ward? Did you go out for drinks in the evening or dinners and hang out with each other outside of hospital? And also asking, how is the IT? So what's the IT system? How do you request bloods? How do you request imaging? How do you make notes? Is it paper notes? Is it electronic notes? Those sorts of things, because that can make a huge, huge difference. I had one hospital that I worked at where everything was paper, and when you wrote a request form, you had to walk it down to radiology to request a chest x-ray or an ultrasound scan, which became pretty laborious. Then I also worked at another hospital where everything was digitized, and actually I personally found it a game changer, and it was extremely helpful and efficient that you could just be sitting in one office, look at someone's notes on the computer, look at their latest blood test results, and you can request chest x-rays and bloods from there just by reviewing their chart. Also, how often do you work late? How often do you work beyond the time that you're technically supposed to be working until? It's quite common, at least in my experiences in the UK, to be working maybe half an hour beyond the time that you're supposed to be working. Some hospitals that happens much less, some hospitals that happens much more. So that's another thing that is worth asking about. And yeah, I think just in general, asking people, how was their experience on the whole? Was it a positive experience, negative experience? Why was that? And is it something that they would recommend? In terms of recommended resources, I can only really recommend things that I've experienced from the UK, but probably my top recommendation would be a website called Messley, which I think the website is messley.co.uk. And they have a lot of information about previous rotations in hospitals where previous doctors who've worked there have given ratings, which can be a shortcut to what I mentioned of finding out from people who've previously worked there about exactly what it was like. And there's a lot of other useful websites and forums, so definitely it's worth having a Google around and just seeing what people suggest. And I guess if I ask myself the question, would I have made the same decisions that I did if I was applying for those rotations again now? I would probably say yes, even though I actually had a fairly negative experience in my first year, or at least at the time it felt pretty negative. I had one rotation where I just really didn't feel the ward was particularly well run. I had another rotation where I wasn't very well supported with seniors, and I had to do a lot of stepping up in terms of responsibility. And at the time, it was pretty tough. But looking back, I did learn a lot from those experiences, so I definitely think I could make the argument that actually I am glad I had those rotations. And this brings me on to my final point, which is that most people will have a positive experience wherever they do end up, as long as you do have the right attitude and approach to it. I definitely feel that your attitude is more important than the exact rotation and job that you have. You might think that an easy rotation is great, but then actually a tougher rotation that stretches you more and you learn a lot more from could actually be a more positive experience. And sometimes if a rotation is not particularly well run, then it gives you an opportunity to have more autonomy and to learn a bit more about how you would instigate having a structure within a team or running a ward appropriately. Yes, I think it can be easy to be a bit overwhelmed with all the different choices that you have and ranking 100 different rotations or 200 different rotations or however many you have. But ultimately, 99% of the time, you will have a fantastic time no matter where you do end up going. And another thing also just to bear in mind, which is specific to the UK, is that in this application process of FPAS, which is for foundation years 1 and 2, I think there's a statistic like 95% of people get their top 5 choices. So even if you go to the painstaking effort like I did of ranking 50 choices, 100 different choices, you'll probably get one in your top 5. And I think the reason for that is just some sort of mathematical thing about how people tend to have different preferences. So different people who rank above you will actually have chosen different rotations on average, and therefore you'll get one of your top 5. But yeah, those are some of the thoughts that I went through when I was deciding which medical rotations I wanted to do and how to rank those. I hope that's helpful to you and kind of gives a bit of food for thought. And maybe that framework might be useful as well if you're having difficulty trying to decide which rotations you want to do. Feel free to share this video with anybody else who you think might find useful, who maybe is going through that process at the moment of ranking their different medical rotations. I hope you get the medical rotations that you want and that you have a great time while doing them. That's everything for today, and I'll see you in the next video.